I'm sure we've all seen in the news the epic achievement down under, where the team from the Sydney project have dived SS Nemesis in 160 meters. First dive on that wreck, and I'm really pleased that we've got a member of the team here, Rus, to tell us all about it. So Rus, tell us about your dive, please.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me, and I'm hoping that I'm able to share some of the experience and some of the sort of diving technical details with your audience, and hopefully we can all sort of share in the epic dive that just happened in Sydney, or off the coast of Wollongong, which is sort of a little bit south of Sydney, about 2 weeks ago. So I'm involved with a group called Sydney Project. I've been with Sydney Project for about 7 or so years now. It's a group that was founded back in the early 2000s, sort of late 90s, early 2000s, so well before my time in diving. And I guess our core sort of goals as part of the group are to dive and document wrecks around Australia, particularly in deeper waters, particularly over that sort of 100-meter mark. And we've done a few sort of different projects, and this has probably been one of our biggest projects that we've just achieved, which was to be the first people to ever dive the SS Nemesis, which lies in 160 metres of water, about 24 kilometres off the coast of South Sydney, or Wollongong, Port Kembla. And a little bit of history behind the Nemesis and how it became a sort of a project for us in particularly. So it was only found, the actual wreck location and the wreck itself was only found last year by a company doing a mapping project sort of on the sea floor. And so they got in contact with Heritage, and they said, look, we've pretty much got an anomaly, which we believe is a wreck. You guys would be interested in. And they did a bit of a scan of it. They dropped some drop cameras on it and took some ROVs on it. And they soon figured out that they believed it was the SS Nemesis. And so from there, we've worked with Heritage before to document and map various wrecks around the coast of Australia. Some of the dive sites that I've been personally involved with Heritage was the Midget submarine off the coast of Sydney, which is involved in World War II for here in Australia, a big part of our maritime war history, as well as some deeper wrecks in about 140, 120 metres of water as well off the coast of Bermuda. We did that about 6 years ago, and we've worked closely with Heritage before for a few of those projects. And we've mapped out and helped them survey these various wrecks and helped identify them. And they essentially, they're not divers themselves. They're very focused on the archaeological and the historical side. So they're always very happy for us to help them, particularly in the deep diving aspect. That's where our skills lie in our group. And we try to do a bit of photogrammetry and help them in that sort of aspect. And they got in contact with us and said, and sort of showed that the Nemesis, what they believed was Nemesis, was out there, and we started planning the dive to achieve it. And I've seen there was a few when the dive sort of went across all the social media and went sort of across sort of various news agencies. People would sort of ask, "Oh, why would you do such a dive to 160 meters? It's so dangerous. We have ROVs and etc." And I think what a lot of people didn't realize is that there's actually a 3D map of the Nemesis already that Heritage did. You can find it on the internet, and we actually used that to plan out our dive and figure out where we were going to see and what we we're going to do. But the biggest aspect of that was that the ROV doesn't always get the data and the footage that you need that humans can. And I think a big aspect of ROV sort of operations in all aspects is that it will never be able to achieve, I guess, the finite things that a human can achieve. And I guess the other side of it is also, and particularly I think what your audience will resonate with, is that there's also that human exploration aspect. We can always, send an ROV to the moon or to Mars or, other sort of systems, but it's always that aspect of sending a human being there that is some part of that exploration aspect, which is I think is what we all dive to these deep wrecks for, is to achieve that sort of human exploration aspect of the dive as well, not just to help in aspects where the ROV can't. And so, yeah, we started planning that dive quite early on. We already had a plan for some deeper wrecks as well, in about 180 meters, and we were trying to. We essentially kind of took the dive plan for that, and it was a dive that I personally planned. So the 180 meter one, and we kind of used the same gases and the same sort of similar sort of run times to achieve this dive. It wasn't too far from 160 meters, and we kind of took the same sort of plan, and we kind of achieved it through that.
Okay, I mean, I'll tell you what, mate. You don't have to persuade me that it needs human beings to go down and look at stuff. I'm absolutely bought in that, and I think everyone else does as well. So, the fact is, we want to go and do this stuff. We want to be the adventure, and you're absolutely right. People see stuff, or give a context to a wreck or whatever that you don't necessarily get if you send a machine down. So I get that. I'll tell you what, though, the idea that you were planning 180 and you kind of fell back and did your 160 instead, that's really impressive itself. So you've obviously had this great opportunity. This wreck has become available. I know there's a lot of history with. In fact, do you want to tell us about the history of the SS Nemesis for the people who don't know?
Yeah, definitely. So the SS Nemesis sank in 1904, so just 121 years old. She was like a coal freighter, steel and wood, so about half steel, half wood. And she was doing the run from Melbourne to Newcastle, transporting coal. And I think she floundered in heavy seas off the coast of Wollongong in 1904. I can't remember the exact date, but so she sank in heavy seas. All loss of life. I think it was just over 30 people that lost their life on that. And when Heritage did find it, they believed that the stern snapped off during the sinking. And that was one aspect that they wanted us to look at as well. So they actually asked us if we could look at finding the stern, because they believed that was involved in the sinking. And we couldn't find it. We barely had enough time to sort of, I think I surveyed the entire, did a lap of the wreck, and just enough time to pretty much cover all of it. But didn't have enough time to have a real good investigation to find where the stern was. And what we did notice was that the bow and the stern were quite collapsed. They were both heavily damaged. And so the superstructure in the bridge in the middle, which is what you might see on some of my footage, is what was kind of like the big structure that was left. And then the front and the stern, like I said, are quite heavily damaged, with coal still on the seafloor surrounding both those locations as well. Okay. So, yeah.
So you guys are the first people to see this for 121 years, really. First actual human eyes rather than an ROV when it was when it found. So that's, I mean, I've been in a privileged position of doing that on quite a few dives, and I know that's an incredible thing, especially when you've got loss of life and you've got a mystery surrounding it and everything. You must have felt that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It was quite an amazing feeling to have. I mean, we so a bit of background, I guess, for the dive itself. We had an attempt on it about a week and a half prior to the actual successful dive on it, and most all of us from Sydney, and so we drove from Sydney about an hour and a half to Wollongong south, and we got to the wharf at about 4 a.m. in the morning, and just in that moment, there's a strong wind warning that was released by our national weather system for the rest of the day. And we went, I don't think we can successfully dive it today. So we packed the went home, and we're all a bit disappointed, and we're all ready for it to go. And then about a week later, we realised that the weather was extremely good during the week on a Wednesday. I was down there with family, and I realised I was the only person that was not available during the week. Everyone else was, and because we've got quite a good sort of team with us, we've got not only our bottom divers, we've got support divers, a supervisor, a diving doctor, a paramedic who's also a technical diver, and so we've got a whole number of people who are helping us achieve this dive. And I would say that these dives like this, as you would know, and as the guys who are probably watching this would know, they're impossible without the support network that is available to achieve this. And so when I realised I was the only person that couldn't make this, I flew back to Sydney from Melbourne and got a lift with my dive gear specifically to achieve this dive, and then flew back to Victoria, back to Melbourne to get the rest of my stuff. And so we had and then that day, that Wednesday in particular, was absolutely perfect. The conditions were great. There was like no wind, almost no swell, and particularly later in the afternoon, we could see through the forecast that the conditions were only getting better, which is something that is crucially important to dive like this. To plan out, you can't just plan like, oh, great, it's a 1 hour, 2 hours deco. It's 6 hours decompression, and you have to almost look into the future and go, getting into the water is the easy part. It's getting out of the water with all our gear that's the most difficult part. So what it's going to look like in 6, 8 hours time when we're getting out of the water, let's say worst case scenario, someone have to do a bit of extra deco for whatever reason. Can we safely get these people out of the water when they've had the most amount of decompression stress on their body, and get them out safely back onto the boat? And so the conditions were only looking better, and luckily we were able to go out there and achieve the dive. And yeah, it's quite a surreal feeling to be able to do that. And so and then it's perfect.
So yeah, I mean, so let's talk about what does 6 hours of decompression look like on in Australia? I know what long periods of decompression look like in the UK. So I guess let's talk about the technicalities of the dive. So you're going out on a boat. Now, my understanding is you use a boat that's mainly used for fishing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so I was trying to find a boat. So a bit of context: Samir, who founded the team back in 2003, he's kind of sort of the lead in the group, and then I've managed to sort of be involved quite a lot over the number of years with a lot of our deep end projects. And so me and Samir usually help. We usually plan out these dives and figure out which boats to use. I think I had 3 boats lined up that I was looking at that people weren't too comfortable in using for various reasons, insurances, indemnities, that sort of thing, which is quite understandable. If something goes wrong, especially for a dive like this, people are liable. And Samir luckily was able to find this fishing charter, which we've used fishing charters before for a lot of our deeper wrecks, and these guys were willing to take us out. So we went out. It took us about an hour and a half to leave from Wollongong to get to the dive site. We got there, so we left at we got there at about 4 a.m. I think we left around 5 or 6. Got to the dive site at 7:30, so just after sunrise, and I think we started the dive at about 11. By the time we got into the water, the actual descending, leaving the surface. So it took a bit of time to set up the shot line. So when we first got there, we threw the shot line in, and we had a bit of a northerly current, which is sort of unusual, I guess, for that part of the world. Along the coast of the east coast of Australia, we have what's called the EAC, which is the Eastern Australian Current, and that normally goes north to south and can get quite strong at times. Even Heritage, when they did that ROV survey on it, they even told us, they gave the warning and said, hey, we had massive currents on this wreck because it's so far out from the coast. Just be careful when you go do it. You're probably gonna have some pretty strong currents. Luckily, we were able to use some software to do a bit of a current prediction. That's usually our worst sort of enemy or nemesis, pun intended, is the currents that are involved with dives like this, because they're quite difficult to predict. And but luckily, we sort of estimated the current to be about 0.7, 0.8 of a knot, which is, for us, our limit was 1 knot. As a comfortable sort of even with scooters, that was sort of, we didn't want to have anything more than a knot because the amount of gear we were carrying. And yeah, so
I mean, I'll just stick in there.
yeah,
Sorry, mate. I'll just stick in there. I mean, that is, to me, given, I would consider a knot of current, or even, 0.7 to be a really strong current, and even with a scooter to be really hard work. So, I have to say
yeah.
that's pretty impressive. I mean, we always, around this country, around the British Isles, we always dive, with much less than that. So it's really interesting to kind of hear that you guys are willing to do dives in that current. And is it because you just do not get slack? The water moves all the time.
Yeah, it's look, anything if you're looking at less than a knot, you're pretty good, I think, in this country. We've been out to dive sites where it's been 4 knots of current, and we've lost like actual shot lines, where you see the buoy itself get dragged underwater and never to be seen again. And that is like that's we try to do a 180-meter dive about a few years ago now. I think it was 2023. Was when we did that. Try to do it at the 180-meter dive, and we put the shot line into the water, and the heavy weight on the bottom of the shot line, and the anchor was dragging on the bottom. And I said, "What do you mean it's dragging? It's like over 20 kilos. How is that dragging?" And they're like, no, it's dragging. And so we said, "Oh, look, we'll try and put it into the wreck this time and try and shot it." And we did that, and yeah, we got it onto the wreck, because the only thing that was resisting the current was the actual buoy on the surface, and that just got dragged underwater and it just disappeared. And I've never seen that before, but that current was something else. And we said, all right, we're sticking around going home, because this is completely unachievable at the moment. And so less than a knot is pretty good, particularly with that EAC that I've mentioned. It's a pretty strong current. And so when you got like less than a knot, you've kind of like, all right, this is as good as it's going to get. But particularly 26 kilometers out, it gets worse the further out you're away from the coast. So that far out, and you're like, yeah, this is just what you got to deal with. And so even with a scooter, it can be a little bit difficult. We try and gear up as much as we can before we jump in, so that way that you kind of jump in, and when the boat positions you next to the shot line, you can sort of be ready to go there. Even still, with the double rebreathers that I'm using and other gear that I'm using, it can be quite difficult. You might have to scooter along the surface for about a good 10 minutes before you get to the shot line, just because by the time you jump in and you're getting all your gear sort of set up and comfortable, you've already traveled a bit of a distance away from the shot, and you have to go, all right, sweet, grab the scooter, take a bearing, and go straight with the scooter for a good 10 minutes on the surface, and then that's why one of the reasons why it took us that time on the surface between throwing the shot line in and getting everything set up to be on the wreck. And we had a few dramas actually the first time we threw it in. So we saw the wreck on the Echo Sounder, and it's because of that sort of bridge and superstructure, and with the bow and the stern collapsed on the Echo, there isn't a great amount of target to hit. And so we positioned the boat to throw the shot line in, and by the time we threw it in and got everything set up, and by the time it hit the bottom, we realized we also connected our deco station, which is kind of like if you imagine you've got the main shot line, which is a single line and like a big buoy on the end, and then we'll normally bring the buoy into the boat, and we connect up a deco station, and that kind of looks like 2 long ropes that go down to 30 meters with a bit of a weight on them. And they're connected to metal bars. And there's a metal bar that sits every 3 meters from 12 to 0. So there's 12 meters. You can imagine you've got 2 ropes, metal bar in between at 12, metal bar between at 9, 6, 3, and the metal bar at 0 on the surface. And then there's 2 other big buoys that connect onto that metal bar on the surface. That's what.
Yeah. So do you? Sorry.
Yep.
Sorry, mate. Do you release the decompression station when the last diver is up, beyond it, and then you float in the current?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we've got a setup where the supervisor will tell the support divers to get in the water when we're about 30 meters, when we're at the 30-meter mark. So they'll have a dive schedule of all of our stops. and what time we'll be at those stops. And around the 30-meter mark, when we're scheduled to be there, in plus 5 or so minutes, the support divers will get in and they'll do a head count at 30 meters. They'll make sure all the divers are there. For this one, it's quite easy. There's only 4 divers, so do a head count of 4. Sweet. We will disconnect the shot line at the deco station at the bottom with there's 2 lines with a weight. So we'll disconnect that. The support divers will just go back to the surface. They'll disconnect the shot line, the deco station at the surface, and the whole station just floats off.
Oh,
and we float off with the current.
So do you have a connection at the bottom and at the top as well?
Yeah, correct. Yep. Yeah, we've got 2 connections at the bottom and the top.
Why do you have one at the top, by the way?
Just so that the shot line doesn't drift too far off the main shot, doesn't create too much of a drag, I guess. And it was just a way that it helps the trapeze sort of be set up in the water nicely, because we've got cylinders set up on the deco station for emergency as well. So it just helps the support divers continuously dive on the station and just and be like sort of just there ready to go. So it's like a big target on the surface. It's 3 big boys, and that way it's just connected up, easy to go. There's 2 connections. 2 is one is none, as the saying goes. So it's just easier just to have the 2 connections and then disconnect them both at the same when we're ready, and that way we're just off. Ready to go.
It's kind of interesting.
So it's a bit of a control system, I guess, from the supervisor's point of view as well. They're able to give that final call of being like, hey, disconnect, because in case they wanted to keep the deco station connected to the main shot for whatever reason, as a supervisor, they've got the situational awareness of the whole sort of aspect of the dive from the surface. If there was a problem for whatever reason, they were like, hey, we're not comfortable disconnecting divers for whatever reason from the main shot, we'll just keep them on the main shot. They can make that call as well. It's not up to the divers to disconnect, it'll be up to the supervisor to make that call.
Okay, interesting. So if you leave the top one attached and there's a strong current, do you not end up all the divers on the bottom dragging the station kind of sideways?
Not entirely, and it's usually done at the same time. So when that head count is done, the divers. So when that support diver comes down and meets the divers, they'll do that head count. The divers will pretty much disconnect, and it's only going to be about, let's say, a couple of minutes before the diver for that support diver goes from 30 to 0 and disconnects, and it's pretty comfortable after that. So there isn't a whole lot of time between the 2 disconnection points. It happens quite concurrently, maybe 2 minutes, if that. Between how long it takes the support diver to leave from 30 to 0 before they disconnect.
And how long did it take you to get from your first decompression stop to 30 meters to you get onto that lazy shot system?
I think it took us about an hour and a half from memory. It was about 80 or 90 minutes was when we met that support diver. So our first stop, I think, was somewhere around 84 meters, I believe. It was somewhere around there. And then it took us about an hour and a half to get to 30 meters and disconnect.
Wow. So we would normally try and have our lazy shot system, our break point at the first deco stop, so that you're never decompressing in current. So I guess you must have had an hour and a half then sat in kind of a knot of current hanging on to the shot line.
Yeah, exactly right. So we had about an hour and a half just doing deco off the main shot, and yeah, it was pretty comfortable though. Like, it wasn't, I wouldn't say really any sort of it wasn't too like I've definitely done deco in stronger current off a single shot where you're really like flagging off the decos off the shot line. We didn't experience any of that, and it was pretty comfortable. But yeah, you're doing about an hour and a half off the main shot before you hit that station, before you're able to disconnect. And I guess with between 84 meters and that first stop, between 84 meters as the first stop and 30 meters, I reckon if we have like longer lines, it would also create sort of snag hazards, and even still you see those decompression lines begin to sort of entangle in each other as well. And the 30 meters isn't too bad. Like, we've done it numerous times, and it seems to work.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing, is you know, everyone's conditions are different, aren't they? As long as it works for you and for your team, that's absolutely the main thing. So interesting the idea that you have support divers. I mean, around the UK, support divers have completely gone. Even, you know, I don't think we've had anyone do a 160 meter dive recently, but certainly, you know, 130, 140 are done, you know, not super regularly, but certainly, you know, relatively common. And we just don't bother with sport divers anymore. Be interested to know what obviously you described you use yours for doing the head count, communicating with the surface, for getting rid of the for disconnecting the decompression station. What else would you use your sport divers for?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dom. So the support dive is actually quite crucial to the way the rest of the dive also runs as well. So they're in that emergency aspect. So if we consider any SMB, any SMB that hits the surface to be emergency. So if you've lost the shot line, the main shot on the bottom, and you've had to shoot an SMB, you will have support divers meet you at the 30-meter mark at your scheduled time at 30 meters. So for us, it would be that hour and a half. And the support divers will bring you emergency open circuit gas in case you need it. So we carry enough open circuit gas to get us the dive. Well, for the most of the guys, they had enough open circuit gas to get them to 30 meters. Because at 30 meters on that deco station, they have the rest of the gas, which is the 40% oxygen, the nitrox 40. They had it at that 30-meter mark, and then the Puro 2 at the 6-meter mark for their bailout open circuit. Now, if a diver was to have a problem on the bottom and they lost the main shot, they obviously haven't got enough gas to get them to the surface. They've only got enough gas to get them to the 30-meter mark and spend a bit of time at the 30 meters while they wait for the support diver. So the support diver will actually dive down the SMB until they hit 30 meters, and they'll wait for that diver to be at that stop and give them the 40%, and then keep giving them cylinders, taking away their cylinders that they've used, and just keep feeding them cylinders until they finish their decompression. So we have cylinders that are left on the deco station ready to go for the guys that need it. If they've had a problem on deco, if they've had a problem on the bottom, they've made it back to the shot line, they've aborted on their main system, and they've gone onto open circuit bailout. And then we'll also have we've also got cylinders on the boat with the support divers in case the diver has had a very bad day. They've not only had an abort on their main system, they've had to go to open circuit bailout, and they've lost the main shot. They've shot an SMB, and they're just doing blue water deco on their own. Bailed out, which is a pretty bad day. They're going to have at least someone to keep them to make sure, you know, hey, you're okay, and here's some extra gas, and here's some extra cylinders, and we'll take the cylinders away from you that you already used, and we'll let you sort of decompress for the rest of the time. So the support divers are definitely crucial in that aspect. We also use them to collect the gears that we don't need. So any bottom stage cylinders that we don't need. So for example, I think I planned out the dive to have about 5 different mixers from 160 to, well, sorry, you got to remember this is from 180 meter dive. So from the original plan was from 180. So from 180 to 30, I think there's 5 different gases that I planned out. The bottom being 585, so 5% oxygen, 85% helium, and then the other rest of the mixers on the way up. The way I planned it out was to have, I made it in a way that the gas switches were done at depths that were easy to remember in an emergency situation. And it just so happened to be that those switch depths were also roughly where were roughly about a whole cylinder's worth of gas, or just a bit more than a whole, a little bit less than a whole cylinder's worth of gas. So you had enough gas to get you to the next switch point per alley 80 cylinder. And those switch depths were the first stop, which is from 180 meter dive is about 99 meters. For this dive, it was 84. So there's enough gas to get a diver from 160 to 84. They'll then switch to another gas from 84 meters up to 60 meters. So the second switch point was 60. And the next switch point was 45. And then the switch point after was 30. And those follow the technical diver career. So if you remember mod 3 at 100, mod 2 at 60, mod 1 or mod 1.5 at 45, and then your advanced open water at 30. You could just easily remember those switch steps, and you weren't having to, in an emergency situation, you went, oh, what was this? What's this, mix that whatever is bang, you can switch, you just were easy to remember and easy to switch to. And then myself, I carried a second rebreather. So I actually didn't really need to rely on open circuit. I had two LE 80 cylinders for open circuit, for the open circuit option, and I had a second side mount rebreather that I used as my bailout rebreather, which I actually needed. My primary system decided to have a problem 3 hours in. For the first time in 10 years, that my JJ CCR let me down, and I switched to my second rebreather 3 hours in and carried on with the rest of decompression.
Mate, you got to tell us. You got to tell us a bit more. You got to tell us a bit more about that, because people will want to know what happened. What's your secondary what's your bailout rebreather? Just talk us through that, mate. It's absolutely fascinating. I'll tell you, it's one of the things you never see this kind of stuff in kind of most of the reporting around this and everything. So absolutely fascinating to get this level of detail. So please tell us.
Yeah, definitely. I'm more than happy to share it, and I'm hoping that me sharing it is, if it helps someone, for any of us to learn from. I'm definitely all about even showing any mistakes, that if I made or whatnot. I think it's a great learning experience for everyone. To be able to share some of the stuff that that I sort of had, and sort of what can happen. My JJ had 2 cell failures 3 hours into decompression. I noticed the first one quite early on, pretty much. So I had on the descent, I noticed the cell number 3 spike a little bit. When I was sort of going down, I hit 160 and had a bit of HPNS, which stabilized pretty quickly, and the cell stabilized itself. I sort of noticed that it kind of went a little bit out of the body logic, but nothing too drastic, and it sort of stabilized into the rest of the dive when I hit the bottom. And I was like, okay, might have just been a bit of a cell spike on the descent, whatnot. And I was also switching to the second loop periodically on the descent as well. And I will just caveat, by the way, that I've diving dual rebreathers is definitely, I won't say that I'm the authority on it at all. It's been done a long time before I even got into diving, but I will say that the guys that I have spoken to are quite experienced in this. Even they have said there isn't like a one-way how to do it, and it's not the silver bullet that I think certain instructors or dive companies make it out to be. I think that if a diver was to double into the double rebreather sort of world, or the dual rebreather world, that I would definitely say it's a tool for a job, for a very specific job, and it's definitely not a solution in most of the dives until you get to the point where carrying that many cylinders is just not feasible. And that's where I think you can sort of start looking at a dual rebreather, because the task loading that a dual rebreather creates for a diver is just massive. It's probably about tenfold having a second loop, and it's not as easy as or as the silver bullet that a lot of people may think it is. And sort of, I guess, and the consequences if something goes wrong are also significantly worse. If at best, if you obviously the most dangerous part for a second loop is the descent. And if the diluent or the gas supply for that second loop is compromised, isolated, or disconnected in whichever way, that's when you can have a problem, which is why you need to sort of verify the second loop hasn't been flooded on the descent. So I'll switch at 50 meters at 100, and then I switched again at 160 to that second loop to make sure that it was working and it was validated. But the problem with that is, at best, if something went wrong, I would have a flooded rebreather. At worst, if I was to switch at a point where the loop was quite negative, I could give myself a negative pulmonary edema, which is where essentially the rebreather has sucks the gas out of your own lungs. And so the consequences of a second rebreather are far worse if something goes wrong than open circuit bailout. So I would caveat that if anyone would consider a second rebreather, was to really do a risk analysis and say, like, am I doing the dives that are really, verified to use a second loop, and what are my other options before deciding on that. But in this case, no, it was it was beneficial. I mean, I could have carried on with the rest of my deco on open circuit with no problems, and that was fine, but it was nice to do it on a second loop. And so for the dive itself, I had that cell number 3 failure, not failure, sorry, sort of spike on the bottom, towards the bottom, and then sort of stabilized on the bottom, and I carried on with the dive and it was fine. I got back to the main shot, and so I had a set point of 1.0 on the bottom, and my procedure is to go 1.3 as soon as I hit the shot line and begin my ascend. So between 1.0 on the whole bottom, and 1.3, there isn't a whole lot of extra deco. I think it's like less than 5 minutes that you get of deco time, but 1.0 has a bit more fat than 1.3 for any spiking, and so I run 1.3 on the bottom. And then as soon as I hit the shot line, I go to 1.3 on the ascent. And it took us 9 minutes to get down, 9 minutes on the bottom. That was the profile, and 6 hours up. So I hit the shot line, went to 1.3, and I think when I hit my first stop, that cell number 3 began to spike high again. It began to go a little bit higher. And I went, okay. And it got to the point where it was...
What does a little bit higher look like, mate? You know, what in numbers, what are we talking?
Yeah, so I believe it gets voted out at about 1.49, 1.5 when you have a set point of 1.3 for the other cells.
Yeah.
So the other cells are about maybe 1.25, 1.3, and this cell number 3 was reading about 1.48 or so, and it was on that cusp of getting voted out and voted back in, which was quite annoying, because I would rather have just been voted out. Because what would happen on the JJ is that cell number 1 and 2 were 1.25, cell number 3 was about 1.48, and it was still within the parameters of being in the verification process. So my deco the average of my set point was greater than 1.3, even though the cell 1 and 2 were reading 1.25, which meant that my deco was considered higher.
So the JJ uses all 3 to calculate the PO2 for deco.
Yeah, so it takes the average of all 3, as long as all 3 are within the verification process. So if cell 1 and 2 are 1.25, cell number 3 is 1.45. The average of that is, I believe, is 1.35. So therefore, your deco is not 1.3. which means it's 1.35, which means that your TTS, your time to surface on the shearwater, was showing 40 minutes shorter than my placebo shearwater, which was on my second unit, which was told to be 1.3. I had a hard point of, this set point that I'm diving is 1.3. So it's actually showing 40 minutes less, just that 0.5 PPO2 difference. And what the other aspect was, it was also not letting the solenoid fire, because the JJ thought I had a set point of 1.35, and so it wouldn't let the solenoid fire. So now we've got 2 problems. You've got not only do you have a set point that is not firing, but you also got a TTS that is 40 minutes shorter. But you know that cell 1 and 2 are probably showing the correct PPO2, and cell number 3 is.
But are you diving a slate on this, or are you using your computer to manage your deco?
I've got 3 computers that are managing the deco. 3 separate computers.
Okay.
Yeah. So you've got one computer that is a complete placebo computer. It's off the. It's not running the cells. It's just doing your kind of like your slate sort of your dive. And the other 2 are into the actual cells, and they're showing what they're doing the deco off the cells.
So you've got a shearwater that's part of the JJ, and what's your other one that's wired into the unit? Have you got a nerd or is this the one on your?
Yep.
It's a nerd, is it?
Yeah, so I've got the JJ shearwater on the actual as a controller. I've got the nerd in the JJ as well.
Yeah.
So those 2 off the JJ, and then I've got a third shearwater that's on the T-Reb, which is the side mount unit, and that's in bailout CCR mode. So that's been told that, hey, whatever your cells are reading, don't include that, because those cells are random. They're on a second unit. They're doing whatever the hell the T-Reb is doing at the time. But it's been told that, hey, be on standby mode. you're doing deco off whatever the JJ is reading, and the JJ is 1.3. But in reality, the JJ has a problem, right? And you've got the first two cells that are 1.25, the third cell 1.45. The JJ thinks it's a set point of 1.35, so it's going, sweet, you've got a bit of extra PPO2, your deco is shorter, and also you don't need a solenoid to be firing.
Yeah.
In reality, real-time PPO2 is actually probably closer to 1.25. So I had to make a decision, and I said, okay, what am I going to do? This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to manually add my PPO2 until cells 1 and 2 hit 1.3, and I'm going to ignore the deco on the JJ entirely, because it's going to think that when I put my cells to 1.3, cell number 3 is going to be like 1.5 or something, you know, and it's gonna think that my average is now 1.4, which is higher than 1.3. So my deco is going to be even shorter. I'm just going to ignore the two computers on the JJ, and I'm going to run the deco off the TREB shorter, which is what I started doing. And it would fluctuate. So as soon as the JJ computer, if it had all 3 cells in the voting logic, it would be about 40 minutes shorter. Occasionally, cell number 3 would just get voted out, and I would see that the deco just drop, and it would increase by 40 minutes. And it was just, I was like, oh, this is just creating a lot of task loading. And so like, all right, I need to focus on 2 things: run my PPO2 manually, do the deco off the TREB, and it's all going to be sweet. And then 3 hours in, cell number 2 started having a problem too, started spiking a little bit too. And I would go vertical, a little bit like vertical. If I was like sort of talking, like looking at someone, and I would go sort of vertical, it would spike. And then as soon as I went into trim, it would go back to whatever it was within a matter of seconds. I've never seen it before. I've never sort of seen that happen before. And it started going in my head. I was like, this is just getting too uncomfortable. I'm not very happy with what's going on. It's a bit of an unknown situation. And I think at that point I decided that, and at this point, cell number 3 was dying. It spiked high initially, and then it just started dropping. It just dropped to, it began to be completely voted out. And so I had 1 cell failure completely, and the second cell started playing up. And I went, all right, I'm not too happy with this situation. I'm going to go to my second loop, went onto the TREB, which was, again, still doing the decompression that it thought of 1.3. And I just continued with the on the TREB, and I made the TREB the computer live. So I switched it off bailout CCR mode and just say, hey, you are now live, and whatever the cells you read, whatever the deco, which you can do on the Chi waters, you can take them from bailout CCR back onto like live mode. And so I went, yep, sweet, TREB is back online, and I pretty much just disregarded everything on the JJ, and the whole computer started voting out. So shortly after I went to the TREB, that second cell just got voted out completely. And I remember looking at the computer, and I had 1 cell was 1.2, 1.1. A second cell was 0.7. The third cell was like 0.2. It was just all over the shop. I had complete voting out logic. The thing was going off like a Christmas tree, and it was just flashing at me. And I was already off the loop by that point, and I went, right, time to call it a day on the JJ. First time in a decade that it's had a problem like that. And doing further investigation after die, because I wanted to figure out what the hell was going on, realized that the 2 cells that had failed, cell 2 and 3, I had done maybe 3 dives on those cells. So that was the 3rd dive. So they were pretty reasonable. But they were from the same batch, and they were actually not as old as the cell number 1, which I believe was actually the one that was showing the real time deco. So cell number 1 was the one that was it was fine, but these 2 cells were from the same batch. I found some of the electrolyte fluid leaking on the actual membrane, so they've actually got a little bit of that fluid on them. And now when I put a multimeter on them, they're showing about 0.01 like millivolts. They're completely dead. So I had essentially 2 bad cells from the same batch. So if that's a lesson learned to anyone, is try not to have cells all from the same batch. And they were they're completely dead. And so But luckily, I had that second loop option that was able to that I was able to sort of crack on to the rest of deco with. But like I said, I had that. I could have had an open circuit solution as well if I really wanted to, and if I had a real bad day. But luckily, the TREB was able to come to the solution, and I was able to continue on with deco like there was like I was just on a second rebreather, and there was no problems.
Must have been super irritating having the JJ flashing at you all the way up.
But
yeah, but oh, nice, good. I mean,
yeah,
great work, and I guess shows the benefits of having as you did, having that system there when you need it. Whatever your emergency system is, if it works, that's brilliant, isn't it? And I guess good skills for managing it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I've always planned my dives off bailout, and I think as most divers probably would as well. And I think that's a smart decision. I do know that sometimes I've heard of people who say, oh, like if I'm going to have a problem on my rebreather, it's going to be in the first 2 minutes, and I'll know about it pretty quickly. I don't need to carry that much bailout, and look, sometimes you'll find out a problem about your rebreather pretty quick. But it just goes to show that it took 3 hours for this problem to become a genuine thing, and don't count for it showing up in the first 2 minutes of a dive. You can have failures hours into a dive, and be prepared that you may have a problem hours into deco, an O-ring blows or something like that, and you've got to be prepared to make the dive and finish the dive on a redundant system. And be prepared that rebreather may fail. And like I said, I've always relied on the JJ for all my dives. I've had like over 2,000 hours on the JJ, and I've never had a problem with it. And this is the first time I decided on what was probably my biggest project. It decided to have a problem, and I was lucky to have that second rebreather. And I will say that it probably took me about 18 months to train on the second loop, and I did a series of dives up to 80 meters on the second loop, carrying a second loop, carrying all the gear that I would carry on this dive. And I even did a dive where I bailed out from 80 meters purposefully from the JJ onto the second loop to see what it would be like to do an 80-meter ascent dive on a second loop, and it worked completely fine. It was great, but you definitely need to train up for it and spend a lot of hours. And I would spend many hours in just 6 meters, 10 meters of water, up to 20 meters of water off the shoreline in Sydney, just practicing with that second loop, practicing all the different problems that you would have on 2 separate rebreathers, and putting a lot of time and effort into that to make sure that if the situation did ever happen, that I was comfortable having to manage multiple problems on multiple rebreathers. And I've made it so that so my system is having a side mount unit, so my loops aren't connected in one. I have to physically take a loop out of my mouth and put it into the second one, which there's pros and cons from various dual rebreather systems that people are diving. But this is just the way that I do it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way, but it's sort of the way that I dive it. And I've made it so that I'm able to share the oxygen cylinders between the 2 rebreathers, so I can manually plug in my JJ O2 into my TREB and vice versa. So that way, if one of them did fail, I wasn't just going to have a very heavy paperweight on my back or on my side. I could still have some sort of source of gas from the JJ into the TREB, or vice versa. If the TREB decided to have a bad day, I could still have plenty of O2. So in total, I had 5 liters of O2 between the 2 rebreathers. Also, we've got those cylinders on the shoreline as well.
No, that's absolutely fascinating. I'll tell you what, a great story there. And I mean, I think the reality is, whatever type of rebreather you dive, at the end of the day, they're just pieces of technology, aren't they? And like any piece of equipment, they have things in them that are weaker, and things, as you quite rightly said, things can go wrong. And we all know that cells in rebreathers are probably the single biggest weakness in any rebreather, because effectively they'll tons of kind of weird gluey stuff, aren't they? And it does.
Yeah, correct.
That's why there's 3 of them, because the manufacturers know they aren't that reliable. You just had a really, really bad day at the office to get 2 of them go down, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I've seen cells fail before as a singular cell. Like, oh, this is a bit bad, but it's manageable. But to have 2 of them fail at the same time, and then literally see the JJ computers just like be flashing for 3 hours, just of like voting logic failed, and just see it just flash, and you're like, oh, fuck, this is really shit. And you just turn the computer around, you're like, I'm just. You're done. Like your day's over. I'm using the other one, and you just have to ignore that computer and go, like, yep, that one's gone. And I actually honestly thought, for a lot of deco on my mind, I was like, oh, did I flood the JJ somehow? When I was, because you're switching loops and whatnot, and you're doing various things. That's another a big sort of negative on the double rebreathers, particularly one that hasn't got a single mouthpiece, is that you're switching loops. And I can tell you that taking something out of your mouth at 160 meters of water and putting something else back in, and then going, oh, I think when I switch to this, I hope it's not, I don't breathe in water. I think it should be good. It's quite an interesting feeling, but in my mind, I was like, oh, did I just flood the JJ somehow, because I'm having a full self failure? And but then when I realized, I thought I had all sorts of thoughts in my mind about what was going on in that electronics. So I was like, oh, it's either got water in it somehow, or there's condensation on those 2 cells, or whatever the hell is going on. And I was quite surprised when I took it out. It was quite dry. It wasn't too bad, for condensation. And I was like, oh, okay, it's pretty good. There's hardly any condensation in it. And then when I looked at inside the cells, particularly cell 2 and 3, I saw a bit of that liquid, and then I quickly realized that wasn't condensation. That was actually electrolyte fluid, and then those 2 cells were completely gone. And so, as you say, a bit of bad luck, but also a bit of a learning point and a bit of a lesson about having cells from the same batch, and also seeing cells fail high initially. So both these two cells failed high before they died. As maybe the divers will know, that cells will tend to fail low quite early on. If they do fail, particularly with condensation, they'll be a little bit slower to read. But seeing cells fail high, it was like, oh, okay, something's weird's going on. But it's a learning point, I guess, for anyone that hasn't had a malfunctioning cell. And I think if you Google search, cells failing high, which is what I did, one of the first things that comes up is that cells that fail high tend to have a manufacturing fault, or have some sort of fault inside them where something has gone wrong. And so that was interesting to see them fail high. And on my, because I downloaded that dive to see the actual millivolt percentage as well, is to see like the initial sort of spike, and then that very sort of parabolic graph that just went down, and it just sort of dies off for those 2 cells, and it goes down. And so definitely something that I haven't seen before, but I was glad that the concept was proven of that, carrying that second loop and being able to finish the dive successfully on that second loop. And yeah.
No, guess all that effort and money and time that you spent getting up to speed with your T-Rev, it kind of became useful that day.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, so that's really nice. Interesting. One of to pick up on a point you kind of made there. Certainly, the kind of people I dive with, it's really common to accelerate decompression with pushing PO2 up. So we would routinely, whatever depth we're doing, we'll push the hit deco stops typically. PO2 will go up to 1.5. By the sound of things, that's not something that you guys do.
Actually, no, it is. So my profile, for most dives, shallower than 100, I'll just dive 1.3 from the surf, like from about 20 or so meters, to change set point all the way down, all the way up 1.3. When I start diving deeper than 100, I'll run 1.0 from like roughly surface, all the way down, all the way along the bottom, 1.0, change to 1.3 as soon as I hit the shot line and begin my ascent. Do most of the deco 1.3, and then about 18 meters or so, change to 1.4 and do the rest of deco from 1.4 from 18 meters up.
Okay.
And so, yeah, a little bit higher as well, yeah.
Yeah, and what sort of, interesting, what sort of CNS numbers do you get out, or do you just not bother looking at them?
No, so I think we were close to about 200%, or just over actually, 200%. On that CNS. I was going to do air brakes. I spoke to some Mitchell about sort of air brakes and the data that, and sort of about sort of what the process was, or what his thoughts were. So my job, my actual job that I do is I'm a military diver in the Royal Australian Navy, and so we do air brakes for an extended period of time where we have O2 stops, and so I kind of know that roughly what the military does is about every 25 minutes we'll do a 5-minute air brake, which is what I think people normally do in the civilian world as well for air brakes, and I was considering doing that. I had it ready to go, to be honest. I had it all ready to go, and I think when I was on my second loop, I was like, if no one else was doing air brakes, it was only I was going to consider doing an air brake, and I went, you know what? I've just had like this first river to go down on my second loop. I'm like, I'm just not going to like just confuse my computers. I had a whole plan. Like I had my plan was to do so at 3 hours I was going to hit 100% CNS on the clock, and then I had air programs in open circuit on all 3 computers, and I was going to go bailout open circuit air on all 3, so that way all 3 computers were tracking that I was doing an air brake. Physically switch to a little cylinder of air that I was going to get a support diver to bring down to me, which they actually did bring it down to me. And I was going to go, switch all computers to open circuit, do a 5-minute air brake, go back to the loop, switch all computers back to closed circuit mode, and do the rest of deco on the loop, and then do that every 25 minutes for 5 minutes. And I think when I had that problem in the first rebreather, I went, you know what? No one else is doing an air brake. My computer is already doing all sorts of random shit. So I went, I'm not going to task load myself any further. I'm just going to go stick it all in the loop. Just go with this, just the PPO2 of what it is, of 1.4, and just sort of have that alarm of high CNS on the computer, and just sort of deal with it that way. I've done last time I did the 140-meter dive, which is about 6 years ago. I had 160% CNS on that dive, and that was 4 hours deco. So in my mind, I was like, it's an extra 2 hours deco. But I'm pretty comfortable on the shot line. I'm not working hard. CO2 production is one of the biggest contributors, if not the biggest contributor, to CNS oxygen toxicity hit. And I was like, I'm not working hard. I'm pretty comfortable. I'm going to continue on with just no air brakes, because at this point in time, there's been other issues that I've experienced in the dive where if I just add anything more to this profile, it's just going to be a confusing, fucking clusterfuck, and it's just going to be random computer numbers going everywhere. And I just want to keep it simple. And I remember telling the support diver, like, hey, I actually don't need that air cylinder. You can take it back up. And I just, but yeah, if someone was to consider an air brake, from Simon's words, he said, he would never ping someone for considering an air brake. I know a lot of guys don't do them at all for a lot longer decos than I do. But I wouldn't say it's a negative if you were considering doing an air brake. But yeah, it's something that I sort of was considering, and then I went, you know what, this is just too much for now. I'm just going to do it all in a loop.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. So what you talk about there is kind of process of dynamic risk management, isn't it? You're monitoring what's going on during the dive. You're deciding what's important, what you can, how you reduce one risk by, maybe slightly increasing another one, if you believe that is a thing. But so it's really interesting to kind of, you've talked us through your kind of mindset through the dive. You've got all this stuff happening, and you're obviously having to make choices and make decisions and everything. So really interesting to kind of hear that process. So I guess going back to the the change of rebreather. 3 hours. What depth were you at 3 hours?
Yeah, at 3 hours, I believe I was at. I'll have to look at the profile again, but I believe I was about maybe 12 meters or so. It was pretty shallow at this point, maybe 12 or 9, maybe even 9. It was quite shallow. I think I had about an hour and a half at 3 meters. Probably half of that at 6. So you're looking at about just over 2 hours 20. Probably another half hour, maybe more, at 9. So yeah, it's probably about 12 from memory. Probably about 12 meters or so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's what I'd have kind of I'd have guessed that, I guess. So not a bad depth. You're on the trapeze. You're drifting in the currents. So that part of things is quite nice, I guess.
Yeah.
One question for you: do you dive as buddy teams or do you dive as individuals?
No, we definitely dive as buddy teams. So we decided to dive as a 4 for that dive, but within the 4, we also had our individual sort of buddy as well. So John and I were diving together, and so John was diving at GUE configuration JJ, and he had plenty of gas as well. And then the other 2 guys were also diving open circuit bailout as well. And John was pretty close to me for most of the dive. I was kind of a little bit sort of in the lead, and a little bit in front of him, and he would scoot up pretty close to me in case there was a problem with either of us. And I pretty much had, if you watch any of the Paralens footage, all the Paralens footage that you may have seen on social media and whatnot, that was off my camera, so that was off my side of my face, of my mask. And you actually even see John's focus light, that little square light. You'll see it kind of like in a lot of that footage. And he was just showing me that he's there with me. He hasn't got a problem, that he's okay. And that way, if there was sort of any ambiguity in that light, I could see it quite clearly on the dive. It was like, all right, sweet, I can turn around quickly and see John, and he might, if he's got a problem, or he would obviously see if I had a problem because I was a little bit in front of him, and he could help me out if I really needed to. And that's the way we sort of did it. Samir and Dave, who were the other 2 guys, they partnered up as well, and they kind of dived a similar profile. They had open circuit bailout between them 2. So three guys had open circuit bailout, and John and I, John had open circuit, and then I had the second loop.
So what open circuit gases are the? I think you said you're carrying 2 cylinders and a bailout. What would they? What were they carrying? You said you said to get them back to 30 meters.
Yeah, exactly right. So I think I said it might have been 5 gases. I might have got that right. It was 4 gases. So the bottom mix was 5.85%, so 5% oxygen, 85% helium. The second one was 14.75. The third one, if I've got my phone somewhere, I think was like 23.55. And the fourth one was 26 something. I'll have to confirm. I can send you those profiles, but I pretty much made a calculation for if anyone at home is doing a for the calculations off that. I did it in a way that where those switch steps were. So the switch steps were the first stop at 84 meters, the second at 60, 45 and 30. All those switches were within the isobaric counter diffusion sort of parameters. So I calculated, I made sure that the increase in nitrogen partial pressure wasn't more than 20%, or for each switch depth, where that risk of isobaric counter diffusion exists. And so those were in line with the calculations to make sure that none of us suffered from that when we did those switches. And we had enough gas to get probably 2 divers comfortably up to 30 meters and 30 meters for a bit of time before they needed that 40% O2 gas.
So between all 4 of you, you had enough gas to get 2 divers from the bottom to the point where you were getting your support divers.
Correct. Yeah. So actually, you could probably, if you had to stretch it, there was probably enough gas to get. I I think if a diver breathes quite conservatively, you could probably do 1 cylinder per diver. So I think John carried, I believe he had 3 cylinders. Samir had 4. So, and then Dave had 2. So yeah, he probably had enough gas to get two and a bit divers. Yeah, up between each depth.
I'm not trying to. This is not. I'm not trying to. Give you the Spanish Inquisition or here, but it's just. People are interested in this kind of stuff. I've got to say, what breathing rate did you calculate your bailout on?
I believe mine was 22 liters a minute for my emergency.
Okay, and that was pretty standard across the team, was it?
Yeah, that's pretty standard across the team. My normal rate is like significantly lower than that. If I was just doing a casual dive, and so I did 22 liters a minute for all the gases, so including from the bottom all the way up. So obviously, you'd hope by maybe the second switch, you were maybe a little bit more calm. And that rate would go down significantly. But I kept it as 22 liters a minute across the board for all gases, and I think that was probably enough gas to have almost like a cylinder, pretty much a cylinder at every sort of point on the dive.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. These kind of tactics. It's interesting to hear how different people do these kind of things.
Yep.
The approach we adopt is a bit different to yours. But it's interesting to kind of, at the end of the day, the only way of judging whether it's the right approach or not is to do it for real, isn't it? And then see what happens.
Yep.
But it's about approach to risk and what you're willing to accept and all those kind of things. So really interesting. And other people, people listening to this, I'm sure will find it absolutely fascinating to hear your strategy. So thanks a lot for sharing it in such depth. I mean, I'm aware that we've run over a bit, Rus, but it's been a fantastic discussion. So what I'd just like to do, mate, if you're happy, is can you just kind of close up and say, just give us a few final thoughts on this dive. And also, I mean, clearly you've got a great team, and I'm sure that 180 meter dive still needs doing as well, which I guess is on your agenda. Tell us, what have we got to look forward to from the team?
Yeah, so I think we're going to try and do a bit more on the Nemesis and get a bit more of a look at it again, and try and map it out a bit more and do a bit more photogrammetry on it as well. So you might see us dive at Nemesis again in a short while. We've got that 180 meter dive coming up, hopefully, which I think if we do achieve will be a miracle, because the last time we did it, those currents were just so strong, and I went, "Oh God, if we ever do this, it'll be one of those 1 in 1,000 sort of attempts." So we've got those 2 sort of projects coming up. I think we might try and hit the south coast of New South Wales again. So those 140 meter, 130 meter dives that we did about 6 years ago, we'll try and maybe potentially do them again. I think we might try and make a little documentary to see if we can get sort of some funding from various government agencies to sort of help with our projects. So make a little documentary about the Nemesis, and so you guys might see that pop up as well, and sort of show a bit more of the whole dive from the whole perspective, not just what happened on the dive. We've got some great drone footage. We've got footage of the whole procedure of us going out there, because as you guys would know, it's not just it's not the dive and the 6 hours of deco that you do. It's all the hours getting the boat ready, getting out there, setting up the shot line, setting up the deco station, getting all the divers out of the water. So we're trying to showcase a lot of the hard work that goes into people behind the scenes, the support crew, the support divers, the supervisor, the medics, and the doctors that help us achieve these dives. And yeah, so got sort of those few things to look forward to, and definitely that same feeling that I got of seeing that wreck when you hit that 160 meter line, that's sort of that depth. And I will say that when we're first descending, you might even see it on the Paralens camera. I initially thought, because I didn't believe that we knew the shot line wasn't on the actual wreck. And when I first saw the sand, I went, "Oh no, we're not, like the thing's not on the wreck." And I remember just looking, I could sort of see a shadow in my peripheral vision, and I remember just sort of looking up a bit, and I could see that black image against that dark blue background, and I realized it was a wreck, and it was probably the best feeling. It's just undescribable, just getting to the bottom. HPNS put aside, you know, if that's also there, so you're kind of like, I had visual disturbances when I got to the bottom, and so which went away pretty quickly. But getting to the bottom and then just seeing that wreck right in front of you, and I think I was sort of the first person sort of in line. I had the other 3 guys behind me, and just sort of being on the bottom and just seeing that shadow and that shape appear right in front of you with over 30-minute visibility. I definitely want to experience that again, and so I think going to the Nemesis again will be a great feeling, and then replicating that same feeling with the dive we've got planned in 180 meters as well.
Mate, that's absolutely awesome. So you know, obviously wish you all the best of luck. And what I would say is, you know, please stay in touch. Obviously, you know, it's fantastic to hear what you guys are doing and the way you do it and all those kind of things. So you know, hopefully, you know, we'll be doing this again in when you've done that 180-meter dive.
Yeah, no, looking forward to it, man, and I appreciate you you having me on today, and hopefully when we achieve that, and we can do another interview and talk about the next dive that we've got.
Yeah, mate, that would be awesome. Well, okay, well, I'll draw things to a close there, but thank you very much for your time and good luck.
Awesome, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, mate. Cheers.
Cheers now, bye.
Cheers, mate. Bye.